Hello and welcome to StrandExplains, a podcast where we discuss what's happening in the world of precision medicine, from weird case studies and interesting facts to interviews with leaders in the industry. I'm Sakshi Shinkal, and today my colleague RK and I will be talking about the COVID pill under clinical trials by Merck.
Hey Sakshi, good afternoon. What is this I hear about the Merck COVID pill?
Hi, RK. Good afternoon. Yeah, so Merck has been testing one of their antiviral drugs in a COVID setting just to see whether or not it could be efficacious in treating patients with mild and moderate COVID.
I understand it's still in clinical trials, is that right?
Yeah, so it's not current. It currently doesn't have FDA approval or anything, although they have just submitted, I think, 2 weeks ago for emergency use authorization. But this drug at the moment is in phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. However, they've had some really, really great results within the first 29 days following an interim analysis.
Yeah. I'm just literally just reading about it. They have a press release out October 1st. They're saying all kinds of things about, efficacy and what have you been able to find about? Well, first of all, even before we get into efficacy, what is it? Is it like an injection? Is it a pill? What is it?
So it's actually a pill. It had begun as a therapy for Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus. And what they saw was it did work against that. And one of the virologists then at Vanderbilt University decided to test it against coronaviruses and saw that it worked pretty well against MERS. And by coronaviruses, I don't mean SARS, like COVID-19 currently. I mean things like MERS and mouth hepatitis virus. And with that kind of background, they thought, let's try it against SARS-CoV-2. Makes sense. And so that's kind of where it started off. But yeah, what's really cool about it is it's a pill. It's not an injection. And which, it's just makes it easier for people who are squeamish, but it also actually makes it easier for administration. The minute you get needles involved, you get injections involved, you need to start, you need trained professionals, whereas a pill becomes OTC a lot of the time.
Right, exactly. And you can package it, and the transport isn't an issue, and good things like that. Uh, but yeah, and I mean, speaking of how good is it? What's the quote unquote efficacy? How what's going on over there?
So, like I said, it's currently it's halfway through the test, or actually not even halfway through the clinical trials. They've just done over a month of trials. And what they saw, however, after 29 days was that this pill reduced the risk of hospitalization or death by approximately 50%. So, just to take a step back and maybe talk about what they're trying to do and how they're measuring the efficacy of this drug, what they were trying to see is if you have a patient who has a confirmed case of COVID and it's been less than 5 days since they got that first positive test, and it's not an extreme case. It's not an extreme or dire case of COVID. They're really only looking at mild and moderate cases. They then decided that if again you follow all of these, you fit into all of these criteria. They'll give you this drug, and it again has to be within 5 days of getting that confirmed case. And what they were testing for were three things. One is that the participants, if they had any adverse events within the first 6 days, which is less than a week, whether the participants were hospitalized or passed away within the first month or 29 days. And they're also testing for whether participants have an adverse event in the first 7 months. Now, to your question about what the efficacy was or what they've seen so far, within this interim analysis, like I said, they've seen that this pill has reduced the risk of hospitalization or death by approximately 50%. Without getting into the numbers too much, the idea is that they had 14% of the patients who were on the placebo were hospitalized, but only 7% of the patients in the trial itself who got the pill were hospitalized. Furthermore, there were 0 deaths in patients who were given the pill versus 8 deaths in the patients who had the placebo. So definitely very, very positive results. And more importantly, one of the things that has been coming up is the idea of these different variants, whether some of them will be affected more, some of them will be affected less. And what they've seen is this drug has demonstrated consistent efficacy against viral variants Gamma, Delta, and Mu.
Right. This is very interesting. I've been, and we've been talking so much about efficacy in the COVID vaccine situation, and here's an
Mhm.
efficacy of a pill. No, there's so many things that are interesting about this. So one of the things is that you're only looking at people who have mild to moderate cases of COVID anyway. It's almost like a piggyback on assuming that people are already vaccinated. I mean, imagine like a large percentage in, let's say, 18 months from today. Imagine a large percentage of people are vaccinated, right? And so you only expect a preponderance of cases to be mild to moderate, right? While of course, the COVID itself would be endemic, the cases would be mild to moderate because most people would have received vaccines, right? And so they've sort of excluded people who will have like severe cases of COVID because I guess they're not really targeting that group. And they're basically seeing for people who maybe start off mild and moderate, mild or moderate, what happens to them if you were to give them this pill versus if you were just going to give them a placebo.
Exactly. And actually, to your point, if a patient starts showing signs that they're going to become a more severe case, they are actually removed from the
Right.
trial.
That's very interesting to me that it seems like a double edge to me because on the one hand, of course, uh, you did prove that okay, 50% reduced hospitalizations, but on the other hand, how many of these mild to moderate cases will even make it to the clinic versus just stay at home and rest up and and things of that nature until it gets so bad that they go to the hospital, at which point anyway this pill isn't relevant, right? So that's maybe one way of looking, but the positive way of looking at it is, of course, that the large, fraction of the cases will be this and will be mild to moderate, perhaps. We're already seeing that in large pockets of India that people are basically the number of cases that are actually being measured is going down, which means that even the people that are getting it are probably just staying at home and they're probably just recouping on their own, right? So imagine if we were to have like an OTC based on something like this, right? Where it's almost like a acetaminophen or something, and then he's like, "Oh, I have COVID. I'm just going to take this one pill." It may not be this one, but it's an interesting paradigm where you have OTCs that are cheap for treating an endemic disease that we didn't know existed until last year and hit us really bad. Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there as a possibility.
So actually, no. To that point, I think the reason the Merck Bill is in the news, these trials have been going on for a while now, like I said. But the reason this trial currently is in the news is because Merck, Ridgeback Biotherapeutics, and Emery, who are the three people involved in this drug trial, is they've agreed to license, the manufacture of this drug to other countries, and the idea is to facilitate affordable global access for the drug. And I don't think I've very particularly not said the name, and I'm going to attempt at it now. It's Molnupiravir, but probably butchered that. But anyway, so the idea is to create broad access in low and middle income countries. One of the things that has definitely been highlighted in the times of COVID is just the disparity when it comes to healthcare and accessibility to healthcare. And if this works the way they are mentioning, and to be fair, a lot of my research is coming from the Merck PR itself. So it is really positive towards them, but it does look like a step in the right direction towards healthcare access.
Yeah, I think is a great point about. I think you mentioned we were talking about this earlier when before we start the podcast that this is probably the real story is that not that there is a pill, but that there seems to be this focus on lower and middle income countries, um, right? And well, I mean, obviously, if you were to have a solution like this that's portable and affordable, and maybe potentially over the counter someday, then these endemic diseases can possibly be treated with a combination of a seasonal vaccine like a flu vaccine, plus maybe OTCs for those who actually get it, and there'll be like peaks and troughs in the number of people getting it, just like the flu, but it'll no longer be the terror it was last year. Uh, I guess that's well, fingers crossed. Yes, absolutely. So that's the hope, anyway. I wanted to highlight another interesting point that I noticed now that I was reading the PR is that the numbers here in in a clinical trial involving a pill that treats the disease is much are much lower than the numbers for a vaccine, right? I just wanted to point out that that's just a statistical thing, right? Because people already have the disease. You already know what percentage are likely to so for people who are, COVID positive and who have mild and moderate, who satisfy these inclusion criteria, you already have a good idea of how many of them will go on to become severe. And if you can show that severity, in terms of numbers of hospitalizations, like you mentioned, one of the endpoints, right? If those numbers are reduced, you don't need too many patients to show that is the case. Unlike in a vaccine scenario where you have to sort of take into account the fact that there's large numbers of people who will never get the disease regardless of whether or not they received the vaccine. So in order to prove statistical significance, you need lots more numbers. So that's the other thing I noticed about this.
To that point, what is pretty interesting is there's no, at least from what I could tell, there's no mention in the trial of whether patients are vaccinated. So, like you mentioned, the people who are getting mild to moderate cases probably are vaccinated. Not probably, at least some of them will be vaccinated. But within the trial, there's no mention of inclusion or exclusion in terms of whether patients have been vaccinated and the effects that might have on the trial results as well.
That's a very interesting point, and I'm very curious as to that particular point, because wouldn't it be the case that if you were vaccinated, then your background probability of being hospitalized is anyway vanishingly small?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know the answer to that, but and then if that is the case, then to prove efficacy or to establish efficacy, wouldn't you need a large number of patients overall? The numbers here are 775 total patients, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So they so they first started by recruiting about 1,500 patients, and sorry, they're trying to recruit 1,500 patients, and when they released their PR, they had hit 775 at that point.
Just as a comparison, the AstraZeneca was tens of thousands, 40,000 if I'm not mistaken. Pfizer was also very similar. So it's very much lower than vaccines. Yeah.
I think, sorry, the other point I was just going to say is all the information we have right now is from a PR that Merck themselves have released. The results, because it's the clinical trial is still going on, the results haven't been officially announced in a paper or anything like that. And so we don't have any information about demographics. We don't have any information about, symptoms. We don't have a lot, and vaccination status. And it is possible that those will change our understanding of how this bill works in this situation.
As it
But
stands, I
yeah,
see that they've applied for emergency use authorization based on these results.
they have. Yeah. So I think that was October 11th is when they announced that. And again, it has, to be fair, we are being slightly critical, but I guess that's part of being a scientist. However, all of that being said, within the inclusion exclusion criteria of their trial, they have seen that they reduce the risk of hospitalization or death by approximately 50%. And so I can see why that is maybe the right move to make.
No, this is very interesting. I think we should definitely keep track of this and see how it develops.
Hi everyone. Although we finished recording our part about the Merck bill last week, the Pfizer bill also came out, and we just wanted to add an addendum to add to completeness and talk about this bill as well. So just to start off, Pfizer has come up with their own anti-COVID viral treatment as well. It's called Paxlovid. It's a combination of the antiretroviral drug ritonavir and an experimental protease inhibitor. Ritonavir might actually be familiar because it's an anti-HIV drug, and it's been attached to this experimental protease inhibitor, which acts by blocking the activity of one of the main enzymes involved in replication in one of the proteins of COVID. And so the way this works is actually really cool. The protease inhibitor actually does the work. It goes and stops that enzymatic action. And ritonavir actually just works to slow down the metabolism of the drug so that it can remain in the system and be effective longer. So the ritonavir is not actually doing anything. It's the inhibitor. And they work together to slow down COVID replication in the body, which I think is pretty cool.
Like with the Merck drug, clinical trials are underway for Paxlovid. However, they've also completed, their interim analysis after having these patients on the trial after having observed these patients on the trial for 29 days. So they've seen an 89% reduction in hospitalization or death of COVID positive patients, which is really the primary endpoint. And if you really look at that sort of data, it's quite compelling on its own. Like with the Merck drug, which I will not try to pronounce today, clinical trials for Paxlovid are underway, but they've also completed their interim analysis and they have announced an 89% reduction in hospitalization or death of COVID positive patients. And, we have to look at these interim results closely, and that people will be doing, including ourselves, over the next several weeks. But we have to remember that this is actually the way in which most people measure the effectiveness of either the vaccine or the treatment, i.e., the hospitalization or death for people who are COVID positive or not, right? So that's the important endpoint there. What was the one big difference we saw, Sakshi, between these two trials?
I think just the thing that struck out and that you and I were discussing was that patients in the Pfizer trial could not be vaccinated. So it was an exclusion criteria to be vaccinated.
Right.
And that actually kind of talks towards the efficacy and it possibly being a more effective treatment
Right.
versus the
Right.
Merck pill, because the Merck pill they haven't specified at least that patients can't be vaccinated. And so those numbers would probably include vaccinated patients.
Right, right. And, there is no a priori harm in including vaccinated patients. It's just that the numbers you need in order to establish efficacy seem to increase because vaccinated patients are anyway not going to be as prone to hospitalization as ones who are
Mhm.
not.
So obviously, it is a little early to make any definitive conclusions because we don't have a lot of the data available for either result. These are interim results that have been released. These aren't the final results. We don't have things like demographic data of the patients, number of patients tested, who all were excluded. There's still information that we are waiting to find out. However, I think just the best thing to think about is it is hopeful. We are finding treatments, and we're definitely a little closer towards the true end to this current pandemic with all of these pills coming out. Thanks for talking to me, okay? Thanks for asking about this. Really a different, I think it's a different one from what we normally do. We typically just kind of explain away information, but given that this is a emerging story, so to speak, and we also don't know a lot about it, it's been an interesting conversation for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you for digging this up. I completely missed it, but this is very interesting. Yeah, I look forward to seeing how this goes on.
Me too. Thanks, RK. Bye bye.